Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar that NASSCOM and the Future of Privacy Forum are co-hosting on consent under India's new Data Protection Act. We're going to be having a great panel today where we focus on two big issues underneath the Data Protection Act. The first panel will be on consent managers, which is a relatively unique concept that has been brought in under our law to help make consent scalable across sectors and domains in India. And the second panel is going to be about the requirement in the law for verifiable consent. In this panel, we have joining us for our conversation on consent managers, a range of experts from different backgrounds. We have Sri Vikram Pagria, who's a director at the NHA, who's handling the coordination aspects of the Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission. He, before this, was a deputy secretary at the Ministry of Finance, Government of India. And we'd love to hear from him on how, in the health sector, through the Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission, a framework for consent management is being scaled within that sector, and what are the lessons that we can learn when we're looking at the cross-sectoral framework under our law. We're also joined by Bertram D'Souza, who's the CEO of Protean Account Aggregators Limited, and he also serves on the steering committee of the Sehmati Foundation. He works deeply with account aggregators in India, so he's going to get us that sectoral perspective from the financial sector on how our existing model of account aggregators can offer lessons for the sort of analogous and the reference point of consent managers that is under our Data Protection Act. We have Dr. Malte Beyer Katzenberger, who is a policy officer at the European Commission, and Malte, please do correct us on your surname. He's the team leader for horizontal aspects of data policies in the Commission, and he's going to bring us the perspective of a similar framework in Europe that can offer us lessons when we think through the rules on consent managers in our law. Finally, we have Rahul Mathan, who's a partner in the law firm in India called Trilegal. He heads the Bangalore practice, and he advises on a range of issues, including technology transfers, intellectual property, and of course, data protection. Rahul's famous for having written 2 books on both privacy and digital public infrastructure, and we're going to love to hear from his wide range of experience working on tech laws and policies in India. And we also have Ashish Agarwal, who heads the public policy practice at NASSCOM, who's going to be giving us the industry perspective on how consent managers is being discussed in India's technology industry today. This panel will be co-moderated by Malvika and me. Malvika is a PhD candidate at the London School of Economics and a senior fellow at the Future of Privacy Forum. She's also, previously, she was the head of the Future of Finance Initiative at Dwara Research. With that, I'm not going to, I want to give our panelists as much time as possible to get into the discussion. We do have a quick presentation just to set the context. I'm going to quickly jump into that, and then we're going to hand over to the panelists for our main discussion. So do give me a second. Great. So very quickly, I think what we're going to just provide an overview of is the 2 to 3 main concepts on consent managers under the Data Protection Act. The first is the definition. So it's a person registered with the board who acts as a single point of contact to help data principals give, manage, review, and withdraw her consent. And crucially, the Act requires that this be done through an accessible, transparent, and interoperable platform. There are rule-making powers for the central government to define several accountability and other obligations on consent managers, but chiefly this principle to be met is that consent managers shall be accountable to data principals and shall act on her behalf, and then obligations are expected to build that out. But we do have one specific obligation in the Act where under Section 13 it's required that data principals have the ability to get grievance redressal from the consent managers. 2 key takeaways from this slide. First, the term person here isn't just a natural person or just an individual, but actually also includes any legal entity. So it can be a corporate entity, it can be a governmental entity as well. And the other key point is that it is not mandatory for anybody, any data fiduciary or any data principal to utilize their services of a consent manager, but the Act still creates this framework whereby we can have this we can have an intermediary between consent between data fiduciaries and data principals. What we do also have is the requirement for registration underneath the Act. So consent managers have to be registered with the Data Protection Board as well. And the Act doesn't specify what conditions will be imposed in that registration, but you do have technical, operational, financial, and other conditions that will be prescribed in rules. Sorry, just give me a second. Yeah, I'm just going to wrap up and then we can turn over to the discussion. I think the slides aren't moving at your end. But finally, the way in which supervision will work is that the Data Protection Board would receive complaints either from data principals regarding their obligations in relation to their personal data not being met, or if anybody provides, intimates the Data Protection Board that, a condition for registration is not being met by the consent manager, then the board can inquire into those breaches and impose penalties. The board can also issue directions and on consent managers. So in the Act, chiefly, we have a lot of enabling rulemaking powers, and we have the ability for certain principles to be met with respect to consent managers, but a lot of the details will come out in the rules. And with that, I'd like to hand over, first of all, to Rahul. I'd love for Rahul to come in and answer the first question that I think that everybody's thinking about when they look at consent managers, which is that what according to you is the role contemplated for consent managers under the Data Protection Act? So and the main thing I think here is that who can a consent manager be? So does it have to be somebody that does this as a full-time business, or can it also be someone that's doing it for a business group as one of the entities in that group, helping that entire group operationalize consent across all their services and products? And would love to hear from you on this, and generally what you think would make this a successful idea.
So thanks, Varun. And I just wanted to start this by saying that we're perhaps maybe just even a few weeks or days too early for this conversation, because and I'm a very optimistic fellow. I'm hoping that the rules will come out very shortly, and so a lot of I guess the gaps in our understanding are going to be filled when the rules come out. And so, everything that I'm going to say now is going to be just some sort of conjecture, connecting the dots and trying to make sense of what this is. And I'm going to come at it from two different directions. I think first, if as you've outlined in your presentation, if you take a look at what the actual Act says, the definition of consent manager under the Act is fairly broad. And in a sense, it covers the full gamut of what consent sort of refers to in the Act. But then as you go down through the various provisions, it starts to narrow, in my view. And in particular, if you look at section 6.8, which you also pointed to, that the consent manager shall be accountable to the data principal and shall act on her behalf. It seems to suggest that there is an additional fiduciary responsibility, or perhaps an exclusive fiduciary responsibility, that would link the consent manager to the data principal and not the data fiduciary. And the way I'm thinking, building this thought, is that it perhaps is incompatible for a consent manager to be accountable to a data principal if it is either through group relations or through any other kind of structure also associated with a data fiduciary, which would then address that first question or that second question that you raised, which is, is it possible for a group company that's providing a whole range of services to also be a consent manager? And I would argue that in this reading, perhaps they could not, and that you would need to have some sort of exclusive separate entity, because that would be the most perfect way in which to maintain this accountability to the data principle. So that's my first take on this. But then I think the other angle with which to look at this, and once again, look, this is all blind men touching an elephant. We maybe just be making huge mistakes. But the other way to think about this is, where did this come from? And in many ways, this is the chicken coming before the egg, or the egg coming before the chicken, whichever way you view that particular model question. We already have a consent management framework in India in two places, and I'm sure Bertie and Vikram are going to talk about this in some detail. We have a consent management framework in the financial services sector, and we have the outlines of a consent management framework in the health sector. In the financial sector, it is the account aggregator framework. The account aggregator framework is actually reasonably narrowly defined. The way I look at it is a data portability framework, and in many ways, the portability framework. And then, if you really want to be Sherlock Holmes and piece it all together, what is the one right that is missing in the Digital Personal Data Protection Act that one would have expected to be there? And that is the right to data portability. And then if you sort of zoom back and see how all of these things are connected, perhaps what the overarching idea is to implement a right to data portability, but implement it through the strong digital frameworks that we've already seen built out in the financial sector, that we are seeing built out in the health sector. And perhaps we will see this built out in many other sectors, and that we will do that through this this entity called the consent manager. Now, that to me would be a very neat solution that ties up all the seeming loose ends, and I'm hoping that the rules will clarify that. But what that does suggest is that you can't just spin up a consent manager. You can't, if you're a company, it's not to say that you can't. You certainly can. You can. There's no prohibition on any of these things, but you can't call it a consent manager, because the Act quite clearly says that the consent manager needs to be registered, and we're going to see what the qualifications for registration are. But this picture that I painted, if that's the underpinning for the way in which the rules come out, then you can't just be someone who is managing consent and call yourself a consent manager, because the rules will clearly define that you have to be registered, and there are certain criteria that you have to fulfill in order to be registered. So I'm going to pause there. This is, I spun a story. I don't know how much of this is going to be true, but that's my attempt at making sense of this. And I hope we'll do another session quite soon once the rules come out.
Great, thanks, Rahul. I think very useful context, really set the stage for where India is today on the idea. But you did mention the one sectoral implementation that we're sort of seeing built out now, that's in the healthcare space. And with that, I'd love to come to you, Vikram sir, on this, because I think one of the most interesting things that is, being talked about in the healthcare space is this use of an electronic consent artifact. And this is based on MeitY's, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technologies Electronic Consent Framework. And I think that's one of the core pieces that you're looking at to operationalize both consent management and also, the technical layer of being a consent manager in the healthcare space. Could you help us understand what exactly this artifact is, how it works, and maybe building up from there, what's the experience been in trying to pilot and drive a consent management piece in the healthcare space in India? Any lessons that we can bring to the general cross-sectoral framework under the Data Protection Act? So over to you.
Thank you, Pranav. And we in the National Health Authority, when we are implementing this digital mission, which is around digital health and helps citizens to share their records digitally with their care provider after giving their consent. So consent forms a very, very main focus of the entire digital health mission. And presently, we have about 500 million people who have given their consent to create their health IDs, which are called as the Ayushman Bharat Health Account, the ABHA numbers, and about 0.3 billion records have been linked with those health IDs. So not only we have a consent manager, I also wanted to tell the audience that this consent manager is operational, it is working. How do we operationalize it? We operationalize it presently through a smartphone app, which is called as ABHA. But there are various other apps also which are integrated with our system. Um, about 10 apps which are public as well as from the private sector. And what it does is when you go to a doctor and the doctor says, "Can I see your previous records?" What the patient get is a notification on her app, and when she says yes, you can see my previous records, then on the screen of the doctor, all the previous records, or in the medical terminology, longitudinal history of the patient is displayed. In addition to this, what the Health Information Exchange and Consent Manager, we call it as the HIECM, what our HIECM does is it also has various levels of consent. For example, when it asks, "Can I see your records?" then the patient has the option to say that, "No, I don't want to share my psychiatric records with you. I am coming to you for dental treatment. So these are my 4 records. This is what I want to share it with you." Additionally, what the patient can also do is it can also select the time for which the consent is given. For example, it can say that I want to share it with you for 6 hours, I want to share it with you for 12 hours, I want to share it with you for 1 hour, I want to share it with you for 24 hours. So different granular aspects of consent are there. Like consent, the patient also has the right to revoke consent. For example, if I have given consent to a doctor for 24 hours, but I want that, no, my treatment is done, I can go in the app and I can also revoke the consent. What we are also trying to do, which we are not being able to do presently, is right now what we are doing is the facility is only one way. The doctor is asking, "Can I see your previous records?" We are trying to build a system wherein the patient is also able to share it directly, not only when the doctor asks. For example, I'm going to a pharmacy. It is about half a mile from my house. I start my car, and when I'm starting my car, I'm sending my prescription to the pharmacy store. So that consent framework we are building, that the patient can also share it with the care provider. We are also building a framework for those who do not have smartphone. For example, if I like we do in Aadhaar, uh, we provide an OTP, and through OTP the consent can also be shared. So this is how we are doing it presently. Yeah.
Thank you, Vikram. And I think we'll have to definitely come back with more specific questions on that. But kind of getting the sense of how we can move from a law to an actual practical workable model. With that, I'm going to hand over to Malvika, who's going to take over the next set of questions. Over to you, Malvika.
Thanks, Varun. And it's already set up in a really interesting way, the conversation. So I'm going to jump straight from that sectoral example in India, which is in the health space, to something we have a little bit more experience with, right? As Rahul pointed out in the beginning, and I think before we started the session amongst the panelists as well. Bertram, we'd like to come to you actually, because just to set the scene, one reason we're really interested to hear from you is that you are actually running an account aggregator currently. For many of you in the audience, and for those who don't know, India has had a set of master directions from our financial sector regulator, the Central Bank of India, Reserve Bank, master directions that set up a framework for these account aggregators back in 2016 already, I believe. And the first set of licenses came out in 2018. So we've had sort of a set of years, close to 8 years now, experience at least with this terminology. But we'd like to go to Bertram actually and ask you, now that we have some experience with account aggregators, and suddenly from data protection land, consent managers turn up. How do you think about these two frameworks as someone running that? And also, do you feel that given your experience in this landscape, I know Protean itself, I'll let you say more, has come into space fairly recently, but what do you think data protection can learn from account managers in some sense, account aggregators? Over to you, Bertram.
Thanks, Malvika. I think that's a great question. I'll start by giving a quick, introduction to what I do and what Protean does. So I look at the products and innovation for Protean as a parent organization, and I'm also looking at the account aggregator subsidiary, which is responsible for the consent management. Looking at the financial sector, if I were to start with that and just try to articulate the role of account aggregators, we have a huge amount of questions that we keep talking about between the account aggregator ecosystem itself. There are a large number of CMs already licensed today. And the interesting model that our regulator has decided to adopt in the financial sector is to go with a regulatory-enabled licensed approach, saying that you need to first apply for the license, get an operational license approval, and then you have connectivity to the entire set of ecosystem players. Today, we have more than 100 data fiduciaries or FIPs who are connected to account aggregators today. And you have a number of the FIUs or data users who consume this data through these consented consent managers, really. So the unique thing about India is that the consumer is given choice at the point of adopting or selecting a flow, which is account aggregator-led flow. That means they get a list of account aggregators as per design. That's how it is designed to give the consumer first choice. They get to select a relationship with the CM. And then over a period of time, they use that CM as their interface to manage their consents, to revoke their consents, and so on. So if you look at the design of TrueBlue consent managers and what account aggregators are doing, we pretty much tick all those boxes in terms of being a full-fledged, approved consent management framework, at least for the sector that we are addressing. But that said, and giving a quick snapshot about Protean, Protean is also cutting across multiple other sectors. And in fact, in the health sector, which Vikram Bukaria spoke about, we have also been working on a PHR app. We are also looking at supporting the entire health ecosystem and getting consent to the user's health data. So there is a lot which companies can also build on this health data, like insurance-led use cases. And we believe we want to also be enablers for that. And we have also been working with the central government on a project called AgriStack, which I'm sure you all have all heard on, which will enable the farmers at the end of the value chain get access or control access to their data today when it is put in the hands of, say, lenders, for example, which makes it so unique in India. And the beautiful thing is in all these three ecosystems where we have a ringside view, it's very differently enabled. So there's no, I would say, common implementation which you can lift and shift to each of those ecosystems. In the case of the health ecosystem, the way in which the consent manager is run is very different from the way it is decentralized, say, in the example of the account aggregator world. And in the agri sector, it's something which is even more complicated because you have so many parcels of data pools. You have, for example, data like land record data, you have crop data, you have geo-referenced village maps, and so on and so forth. How do you give that access to the farmer, and how do you make it easy for the farmer to know what he's sharing and for what purpose and intent is he sharing it for? And how do you enable the farmer to go to a level of partial consent, which is very hard to do in, for example, the financial sector? You can't share a certain limited set of transactions. You share your entire transactions from your from date and to date. So I think I'm very curious to see where this conversation goes. Extremely excited to be a part of this panel, and I would love to bring in diverse insights from these three sectors as part of the next conversation.
Thanks so much, Bertram, and that's actually super useful to hear from someone working in an account aggregator space, looking to scale across the different sectors. I had one quick follow-up question, which I think is also relevant to Malte, who I think we'll go to next, which is really in relation to the business model for account aggregators. I think this is the same question that's facing data intermediation services in the DGA, which we'll talk about next. But I don't know if you want to come in right away, Bertram, or just in relation to how you're seeing the revenue stream for something like this.
I think that's another great question. It's something which, in my view, is evolving. I don't think there's any established method which exists in any industry to look at as a reference point. In global markets, and we have also studied that fairly well, it's implemented very differently, where you have consent managers pretty much sitting virtually behind, either data fiduciaries or the data seekers. And the consumer does not even get to know in many of those cases, say in the European markets, from what I last read, of which consent manager is actually getting invoked. So they're more like service providers, if I were to put it that way. And the kind of visibility they have to the end user is much watered down, at least to the best of my knowledge. That's what I could gather. What I would like to respond to your question is business models, I think, will keep evolving. And I think you need to look at this entire framework as a digital public infrastructure. I don't think, in my view, looking at this as a monetization on data is an option. One. Two is, I don't think you can look at this as something which there will be one size or one winner will kind of take it all. This market will be extremely fragmented. And I think consent managers will obviously operate in spaces where the consumers are using them. So at some point of time, I think while it is more ecosystem funded at this point of time, it will at some point maybe move into a slightly different model, which might also be users looking to pay for the consent frameworks where they see additional value coming from them. But at this point of time, I think it's going to be a high volume, low margin business, which is pretty much like any technology infrastructure play.
Thanks, Bertram. And actually, I'm going to pick up on both of those when we go hopefully into the question. So this question of the consumer and actually when does the consumer go to a consent manager? But we'll come back to that. Malte, thank you so much for joining us. I think you're a unique perspective for us because I think the European policymakers have kind of proceeded alongside but independently, most policymakers in the data regulation landscape. But what there's so many things we could talk about, the GDPR, Data Governance Act, Data Act, you name it, AI Act. But we really wanted to focus in on the Data Governance Act because of your expertise there. And if you could just tell us a little bit about data intermediaries and given what you've heard now, where you see the overlap and also maybe how you see consent working in this landscape, given our experience with the GDPR to date. So over to you.
No, very happy to be part of this. I hope the internet is good enough. I think I will maybe respond in several iterations. First, I think we have seen what I could call isolated pockets of intermediation. The European landscape knows the account information service providers under the Payment Services Directive, which was revised in 2015. So a small kind of really targeted setting. There's been work ongoing for a number of years to interconnect also health registers across the different member states of the Union.
I think we may have a pause. I'm just double checking that it's not just me, but I think others also are not able to hear Malte at the moment. Great. Okay, in which case we'll just wait for him to come back. And maybe we can just go into this question of data intermediation itself. I mean, I'm hoping when Malte is back with us, that's where we'll pick up. What I'm going to do is just quickly ask the panelists to come in and also Ashish, because I know you've been following this across the sector in India. Really on this question that we were at prior to the break, which was around incentivizing others to use consent managers, right? So they always talk about the consent manager vis-a-vis the consumer, but I guess an important part of this puzzle is actually who's plugging in the FIUs in the account aggregator speak, but any other data fiduciary who's now going to have to work with the consent manager as well. So maybe I'll invite Ashish to kind of pitch in with that, but really curious to come back to all the other three panelists that we just spoke to on this question of value and relationships in the data landscape.
Thanks, Malvika. I think very interesting, and I'll pick on a couple of points which I heard on this and also what we are seeing and maybe contextualize some of it in the context of what I have myself experienced. One, I think it's going to be very difficult to get this consent manager going. I think that is one potential way to think about this. After all, it's voluntary, right? So that's one. Second is that you already heard that how will this play out as a model is going to be maybe tricky, if not really difficult, because if you have to kind of separate it out from fiduciary altogether, and then probably there's no data monetization angle, which is good because it shouldn't be there, then where does it leave us? And then if you add this larger effect of the fact that typically when you think of unbundling, so I see this consent manager as an unbundling in the entire data processing process where the consent manager pieces or management piece is being unbundled. Usually this kind of a thing invites resistance from the industry. Because clearly and we have seen this, for example, in the insurance sector, right? I mean, you get half the country to sell to the other half, and because the incentives are front loaded, and that's what makes sense. Now, if you unbundle that, it just becomes really difficult. And we have seen that unbundling in the national pension system, where you said that, okay, we want to make sure that the consent is actually very informed and people are not swayed by commissions and all of that. And so let's do that. And we have seen that. And then what has happened is that really it just boils down to the quality of product to create a pull effect. To say that, you know, people have to want it, and nobody's going to sell you this. So nobody sells NPS to anybody. People want to buy it and then they buy it. So then when you put that context to say that now we have got this consent manager thing going in the data space, I think one, it's going to be very difficult. So second is that now if you just literally take this idea that consent should be as easy to withdraw as it is to provide, then it's a very powerful idea. And because I frankly think that when we think of cookies as a way of managing consent, I think that's, I would say that that's somewhat ineffective to say in some sense, because clearly that last part of withdrawal is not that easy, and you have to keep on doing this cycle of cookie management repeatedly. Now, one bright side of this so I've argued about why it is really difficult. See, a lot of people will also potentially look at this to say that, you know, and I'm hoping they do, that they don't want to land up with the data protection board on the way they are managing the consent. And one of the ways I would presume to avoid that grief would be to actually think of utilizing consent managers. So that could be, I mean, I'm really picking at these straws, but I'm saying that is at least something that is useful there. And then finally, what is also very useful is how it is implemented at a technological level. So I'm a fan of the account aggregator framework purely because of what it offers me. And similarly, without looking at account aggregator framework, just in the way some of the consent management is actually implemented in the banking sector, whether it is to do with my credit card management and so on and so forth. On my mobile, I'm, as a consumer, empowered, and I can give and withdraw my consent seamlessly in an app. And I think that kind of an implementation is also going to be powerful if this is going to be successful. So, and again, this is at a cross purpose with some of the stuff where people would want a customer to be sticky just by making it difficult to withdraw consent. So I think today, maybe government has a role there, because we often neglect the fact that a government is a large data fiduciary, and given that they are, from a very public standpoint, I think some active effort from the government to drive consent manager in government's own functioning as a data fiduciary could be the initial set of steps to demonstrate some of this. And then obviously some startups, some enterprises, some data fiduciary, we will need to encourage to step out and say that, you know, look, we are going to do this nicely and demonstrate the effect of this. So I'm hoping some of that can happen. And to the point which Rahul made, maybe if I would like to disagree, that can it be done without really carving it yourself out as a separate entity while still maintaining the integrity of what a consent manager is going to do? I think that could be powerful, because then that could make it easier for a lot of people to try and implement this, but I don't know where that journey is going to be. So I'll stop there, Malik.
I'm going to jump in here just because I know we have Malte back. And I actually want to, this is the risk, Malte, of Zoom misfiring. You're going to have a new set of provocations. I think just to pick up on what Ashish was just talking about right now. I mean, clearly government and other actors who are traditionally the fiduciaries in our societies are the ones acting up to, I would say, almost this, it seems like consent management or data intermediary services seems to be a way to make data flows visible. So it's more about data sharing effectively through channels that we can see, as opposed to consent or the consumer, so on and so forth. Some might say that's the case. Would love to hear your experience from the Data Governance Act and how you see this all playing out.
Oh, there's so many things I could pick back on, and Zoom really played me a trick. What Ashish just said, I think the cookie thing is one of the key examples. It's invisible. You don't have no trace. So one of the things is certainly what we call consent receipts. But let me maybe tell you the story, how we got to Chapter 3 of the Data Governance Act. For those who won't find it, it's Regulation EU 2022 number 868. It's in force since September last year. The idea was that many people came to us, hey, I'm going to revolutionize data relations on the internet, on the consumer internet for you. I'll give you a personal data vault, and from there on, you will be the master of your own data. And some other people were saying, we don't necessarily need the vault. It's only about agreements. And the only thing is that you have an app to basically manage all the flows, that you see the flows happening, that you have traces of the flows, traces of the consent you gave. And this happened fairly long. I mean, for past 10 years, people like this came to the European Commission, and we were always saying, what can we do for you guys? I mean, in the current framework, we assumed that the market would have to solve the problem, that apps would have to come up in place, and people would find this what we call a data subject, so a data principle in the Indian terminology, that they would find this interesting enough at some point, or that some industry actors would band together and say, we make this now a collective exercise. But it hasn't happened so far. So the interesting development, I think, from the governmental side is that the Flemish government, which is the northern half of Belgium, there is a bunch of people who worked around Tim Berners-Lee's SOLID protocol, which gives you the data pods, as they call it. And they say the government will roll out the pods in a use case scenario. So the government will develop use cases with enterprise that need certain data in a privacy preserving manner, let's say for a human resources recruitment case. And then with the company, they will develop the use case. It will be a seamless experience. So you onboard the person, the data principal, the data subject through this way. He will probably see what's going on, like you will see a credit card payment happening on the internet. You see you're redirected to another site, and then you're redirected back. And so you have a certain visibility that something magic is happening, but it's actually the problem of the onboarding company to say, I want to use this type of service. And that's maybe also then an answer to the business model. And because we were asking these companies, so is a business problem for you a problem? And the first answer was saying, no, we ran a thin layer of code that's inexpensive. We are not supposed to hold your data, which would actually be expensive, because then you have data breach, liability insurance, and all these kind of things to take out. But we only operate code. It's an app that has a certain maintenance cost, but it's not enormous. So we will do, like the credit card companies have always been doing, we'll take a fraction of the value of the exchange that the company believes it has in managing basically consent for them. So it's a means also to outsource, because it was very clear to us as well that individuals would not pay for a data vault. I mean, that was very clear. So the business models we thought was not such a big problem. So it may be transaction based. It could also be a regular kind of subscription model. But it should be, as I think speakers before me said, also it should be relatively, I think Ashish was saying this is an infrastructure. It's like having digital payments embedded in your kind of web shop. It shouldn't be terribly difficult from the flow, and also from the from the relations. Maybe two last words on what the framework actually is. So it's going broader than consent management. It can be consent management, but it can also be all sorts of other services. It can be app stores. It can be a data vault. If you think of health, you may actually have certain data be processed in your data vault by apps that the App Store brings you. And what we wanted to solve with Chapter 3 is two problems. At the data privacy or data protection level, we wanted to make sure that this intermediary has no incentive because it eyes for the value of the data. So there's a strict prohibition on the intermediary that it cannot use the data for anything else. So there is no wrong incentives, make people share than they normally would do. And the second problem we want to solve is that we wanted to disintegrate marketplaces, intermediaries from people active, so that the Amazon self-preferencing problem from a competition policy point of view doesn't occur. So we are very strict now on these intermediaries. We will see whether that works for them, because many told us, wow, in digital you have to be integrating certain things. No one is just paying for piping, so to say. So we'll see whether it pays off. We have just launched this legal framework. People can now register, but not in all countries yet, because there is only the relevant authorities are only in place in 14 of the 27 countries of the European Union. So we'll evaluate this. We will do an evaluation actually already next year to just see very quickly, did this work? Is this too strict? And in that context, let's maybe round it off also to say that we're extremely interested with the collaboration with India. It's defined at all levels of the Commission, at the commissioner's level. So we want a partnership with India, and we want to get inspired, because I think we have a very, very many things that we, from a conceptual point of view, we have in common, which is empowering individuals with their data and making portability work. And certainly we can expand also on this last subject. So thank you. And thank you to Zoom for having allowed me to speak.
The ultimate data intermediary, right? Speech intermediary. So I think with that, actually, that was a fascinating round of comments. I think we got a lot in, even though we've just begun sort of half an hour, 40 minutes ago. I think we only have about 15 minutes now, slightly more, close to 20 for a discussion. So I'll just kick off with the first question and then hand back over to Varun to take us through, canter to the end. I have, again, so many things I want to pick up on in this conversation, but I feel like if I had one round of provocations to ask all of you, I feel from hearing you, there are two there's a tension, right? On the one hand, I hear this appetite to keep the data transaction separate from the financial or the health transaction, and somehow to make that valuable and to have that accountable to a separate framework. But on the other hand, I hear that, ultimately, the consumer it's going to be hard for the consumer to pay, either because of cognitive load, they simply do not understand what's going on, or they cannot pay in a country like India, where we have many people still at the poverty line or below. And in that context, I guess my question is, how do you reconcile this tension? I think Rahul began with this, pointing out the fact that really it's data portability by design, as opposed to by strapline, that you have to be accountable to the consumer and act on behalf of the consumer. But we can see that the market doesn't really work because of the consumer, right? So with that provocation, I don't know, both as policymakers and as people running companies that are seeking to reconcile two seemingly unreconcilable things, I throw that back to you. Just to make things simpler, I saw Rahul nod vigorously, so maybe go to Rahul first, and then Mr. Pagaria and Bertram, maybe we come to you after that. And Malte, please feel free to jump in as well. So with that, over to you, Rahul.
No, the only interjection I want to make is that, why are we saying that this is not something that the market wants? So we've got a working ecosystem, we've got great stats for the ecosystem. So I am not going to, Bert will talk about this in much more detail. But if you go to the account aggregator stats page, 40 million consents have been processed. This is up from 20 million in August. There are clearly people, and this is processed consents. This is a data principle saying, look, I consent to this information moving from an FIP to an FIU. This is a very, very new ecosystem. But in August, there were 20 million consents. We're now in January, and there are 40 million consents. That's the rate at which this ecosystem is moving. So I don't really understand why we are getting tied up in knots about trying to work out a business model for this, if it is actually working. And in all the digital public infrastructure we've built, we keep worrying about what the business model is, and the market goes ahead and and delivers. I mean, UPI is at 12 billion transactions a month. We still asking ourselves, what's the business model for Google Pay and PhonePe? At least this has been my experience of a decade and a half looking at digital public infrastructure. There's something that doesn't align with the way economists, analysts look at this, and the way the market players actually just embrace this technology and I don't know, dive headlong with no idea for profit. I don't understand what the logic is, but 40 million consents up from 20 in just 4 months, 3 months, that must tell some sort of a story. But so I guess the only thing that I would say is that I would let this play out, and I think that we certainly have some ideas around how we need to balance, I guess, some of the things that Malte spoke about. I think, the way in which India has done it, and I've written about it in my latest book, Shameless Plug, where I talk about the fact that by having a separate entity, the consent manager, we have created a double blind for privacy. Malte, I know that we've discussed this with the European Union. This is very different from the Solid approach, because in Solid, you're putting a lot of obligations on the entity that's managing the pod to do all sorts of other things. Whereas the double blind, where we keep the data flows separate from the consent flows, allows us all sorts of interesting technical solutions to some of the challenges of privacy that is unique to this Indian model that has been implemented in Account Aggregator, and I think the NHA will also implement. So from a pure privacy perspective, I think that certainly we've got the Solid approach, and then we've got the Account Aggregator approach that are dealing with two ends of the spectrum. And between these two, we're going to find a business model. I am very, very certain that companies are not going to be spending money on this unless there's some sort of a benefit to it. And quite frankly, none of us are experts at figuring out business models. We'll just leave it to the market. I'm sure they will continue at the pace they have.
Maybe that's the cue for Bertram, who's in the market. Actually.
Rahul, thanks for your optimism on behalf of the entire AI ecosystem. If I can start on that. Just basically following through, I think the need for Account Aggregator in the first place stemmed from the fact that India is such a diverse country, billion people, so many of them underserved in terms of credit, in terms of other financial services. And that was, I think, one of the original premises of why Account Aggregator and how can digital tech coupled with the AI ecosystem, how do we take credit to the masses? I think where we are right now is solving for some of the more, I would say trivial issues, given that volumes are growing. And I think to Rahul's point, there's definitely something which is working and working well. But I think we need to solve for the future. And if I were to look forward, maybe 5 years from now, I think we would not be having the discussion on business models. I think that issue would have far been streamlined by then. I would be looking more at it from a user experience perspective, saying that if each of the data fiduciaries in India under the DPDP Act, which now gets enforced, was pretty much mandated to set up their own consent manager. Just imagine how hard it would be for a citizen. For every time you need your data accessed, you need to go into a separate interface or app and kind of approve it. And imagine kind of at one point of time trying to bring all of those into one view where you can figure out which consent managers am I using. It's very hard for us to visualize at this point of time. And I think that's the challenge in a digital economy, is that things grow so much faster. At 10x speed, it's very difficult for us to really keep pace with what's going to come even next year. So I think we will not really be worried about the business model. The way I look at it, I would worry about user experience. And I would worry about users who do not have sufficient data from the single kind of ecosystem consent manager to be able to pull data from multiple ecosystems when they need it. So if I'm a farmer going for a loan, how do I have multiple consent frameworks and multiple data fiduciary ecosystems firing for me at that point of time when I'm actually seeking a loan at the last mile outlet. So I would just leave that thought on the table. And I think Rahul summarized the other point as well really well with regards to how different the global ecosystem is from India. I think there is a lot we can keep learning and tuning and evolving our initial framework. And I don't think we are maybe perfect in terms of our current structure and the way we are operating right now. But I think if we work iteratively as an ecosystem and keep improving on it, I think also looking at the fact that we are in an NASSCOM panel, getting all of the participants out there to innovate on top of the AA rails with use cases and challenging us as the AA ecosystem on what we can change or what we can do better. We would love to hear from you.
Ms. Pagaria and Malte, yeah, feel free, please come in.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we have started recently in health, and for us, we have the consent manager as a digital public infrastructure. But with respect to your question, I agree with what Rahul said, that let the market play out. Yeah.
But maybe here comes my question. I mean, if the use of consent management seems to be voluntary, at least in certain frameworks, what makes you certain that the market will actually play out? And I give you that the same remark has been made with respect to the intermediaries under the Data Governance Act. Some people will say you have to make this mandatory to use, whereas currently you can pass through this intermediary, you cannot. I think the difference might be, and I'm not sure how this will play out with the broader data privacy bill, is that in Europe, if you choose to use consent as a means, you have to have also all sorts of documentation responsibilities. So you have to make sure you did it in the right way. And that's where you could have an interest to use someone who can professionally do consenting for you. But that's the only lever you have, so to say, from a public side, to say you have to make sure people do consent properly, and then there are other privacy advantages that a solid pod type of infrastructure would have, because then you can do privacy preserving data processing. But that's a separate discussion. So I wonder what makes you so hopeful that the consent managers will be actually used if their use is in many settings still voluntary.
Do you want me to attempt to answer that?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Malte, look, I think just to explain how it's been rolled out in the financial services sector at this point in time, and Bert will correct me with the exact numbers, but we've got close to 2 billion accounts that are capable of being connected. What does this mean? This means that if I've got a bank account in a particular bank, and there's another lender, a different bank or a different entity that wants information. There are 2 billion such, and maybe 2.5 billion if you also include, the other sectors, insurance and pensions and all those things. So what's happened is that there is this integration that has happened in the financial services sector through the rails of the account aggregator ecosystem. That is, in a sense, the passive background. Now, I, as a potential borrower, have the option of either using the old-fashioned route, which is going to my bank, taking a printout of my financial information and carrying it physically to a lender and giving it to him, or signing up this app and with a click of a button, selecting the information that I need and actually moving it to this entity. That's digitally signed, that's completely accepted under the financial sector regulations. So what will you choose? And so, quite frankly, I know it's voluntary, but in terms of, what is a convenient, efficient mechanism that has also got regulatory certainty, this is certainly the sort of the option that's playing out. And why are 40 million people using it? Because I guess some of them thought it was convenient. And I think the other thing that plays out here is that in many ways, this is an opportunity for those who are not yet fully within the formal financial system to find a toehold to get into the formal financial system. And as you perhaps know, in India, we only have about 300 million people in the formal financial system. We have over 1 billion people that are outside. So there are many reasons why. I mean, this may not be true for Europe, but there are many pull factors why this is. There are reasons why, even though we keep it voluntary, that people would opt for it. One other perhaps negative reason why we don't want to keep it, make it mandatory, is because we've had a bit of a bad experience in the past when we made our digital public infrastructure mandatory, and I think we want to quite correctly keep it voluntary. So I'm not, without sort of speaking about the health sector, which is way more complicated, you can see many such use cases. If you can just extend this there, second opinions is a very, very obvious use case, but there are so many other use cases in the health sector where if you can connect all the relevant participants in an ecosystem like this, we can see value. And then if you just sort of take one step out, zoom out a bit, if you connect what is already established in the financial sector with what is established in the health sector, which I think Protean mentioned that they're thinking of doing, you'll start to be able to transport health information into the health insurance space to separate consent managers, but unified in a sense using the Data Protection Board, because these will all consent managers will have to be registered with the board. And then you start seeing very, very powerful cross-sectoral use cases. So, I mean, I think these are all the reasons in my mind why this is going to work. Of course, time will tell whether I'm right or wrong, and then, of course, I have the opportunity to write one more book.
So, thanks.
Can I come in, Varun?
I just want to add one line of context, and everybody who's online right now, we're going to steal a couple of minutes from the break because this is a very interesting point of the conversation. I just wanted to ensure that as the last round of comments in the last couple of minutes that we have left, Ashish, Malte, we've had conversations before this webinar on how to think about consent management beyond just sharing of data between data fiduciaries. I think that's been a bulk of the conversation so far. We've seen detailed explorations of what that could look like, cross-sectoral, cross-fiduciary, etc., but the conversations not really looked into other kinds of processing operations that could also benefit from consent managers being involved. So just to give two examples from the Act, I think the Act creates a reverse burden of proof where a data fiduciary has to prove that consent obtained was valid. And we've also got new standards of consent around specific, clear, affirmative action, and purpose limitation to that extent. So where consent managers perhaps would be different from what we've seen with account aggregators is their ability to deliver value for data fiduciaries in these new concepts of consent management across processing operations. With that, Malte, I'd love to just come to you on our little conversation that we had on the comparison with digital signatures just for a couple of minutes, and with Ashish, I think like it would be great if we could end with just a few chats we've had internally on what all consent managers could be beyond just sharing. Over to you, Malte, and then Ashish, please do close us out. Yeah.
Indeed, I mean, Europe has not yet benefited, I think, from the Aadhaar project experience. We're just about to mandate as European Commission that all member states enable digital identity. Some countries have been, especially one that you know well, has been quite, that's now outside of the EU, has been always reticent for ID in general and surveillance that comes with it, and digital ID could be even forcing. But now we will have this EU identity wallet, so that's also where the kind of the wallet/pods idea comes back, that you want to store certain information and then indeed have digital signature services. So that's something that is not strictly regulated by the Data Governance Act. Digital signature services comes under the so-called eIDAS regulation that has currently been revised. But I wanted to say one other aspect could indeed be that we can easily see our kind of DGA intermediaries that we're talking here today also as portability facilitators, that they can make the portability that can be currently maybe relatively causing a relative friction because it's sometimes difficult to get from a data fiduciary who's not quite ready digitally to export data, to manage this process and make all the sign-up processes. I'm really the person that has a right on these data, and I can identify this person. I can make this person sign something that you can also accompany someone on the portability process in the wider scope. So that's where why we have regulate a bit broader with the Data Governance Act than consent only, because we believe the whole digital data workflow could come out of one kind of service, if that makes sense to you.
All right. So I think very interesting conversations. So I do want to share the optimism of Rahul. I think that will be great and amazing and wonderful. But Malte, your question of caution is something that also relates to, in some sense, what we need to actively think about. Overall, I think it's one point which you mentioned, Malte, that if it is very visible that just from a simple legal compliance perspective, there is a differential in terms of what it entails to not be using a consent manager. I think that's a very simple thing, and it can be very powerful from an industry point of view to say that just let's get on with it. And I think on the innovation side, I think the account aggregators are already sitting on this model. So in the financial sector, broadening it beyond transaction and access to information about the account, I think that sort of a thing is probably going to be the first area where this should kind of really expand out and grow. One more interesting thing which we haven't mentioned as a tool, and probably I could get shot for saying this, but I think when we think of e-commerce as an example, right, where a lot of stuff happens, something which also is tried out in India is now voluntary commitments in the form of safety pledges and so on and so forth. And I think, and there's also a role for industry. So industry associations to say that, how can we work with the industry to create that ecosystem where people will stand up both in terms of thinking about the opportunity, but also saying that encouraging the first movers to take that step. And I think it can be very powerful. For example, when I say e-commerce, I think the entire bit of dark patterns, I think a whole lot of dark patterns are about managing consent in a manner where people are misled at some level, right? So a consent manager can be a very powerful tool to unbundle that problem of dark patterns, and dark patterns are across online world. So I think understanding some of those incentives for creating that parallel universe where there are people who are moving in this world of consent managers, and then people who are not, then they start seeing themselves as people who need to transition. And I think that is a journey that we will come in. So again, I know we are at the end of time. So thank you all for joining in. This is a conversation we will love to have once the rules are also back, and we will engage with you because this is a journey which is I think definitely going to take a few months, if not more. Thank you, Varun, back to you.
Sure. So thank you, everyone. Please stay online for panel number 2, which will start at 6:10. That's 5 minutes from now. And for all our panelists from panel 1, thank you so much for joining us, and do stay in touch. We look forward to continuing this conversation on consent management. Thank you.